The flames consumed everything she had ever loved. Freya Shadowfang knelt in the ash and ruin of her cottage, her hands pressed flat against the scorched earth where her healing table had stood for 3 generations. The wood her grandmother had carved, the herbs her mother had dried, the books she had filled with careful observations about every remedy she had ever crafted. All of it reduced to smoke and ember, while the pack she had served since childhood stood in a half-circle behind her, their torches still burning. She could feel the heat of those flames against her back, could smell the acrid bite of burning rosemary and sage mixing with the char of her life's work. Her wolf whimpered deep in her chest, too weak from grief to do more than tremble. 4 months. It had been 4 months since Garrett had died in the border skirmish, and her wolf had barely stirred since they lowered his body into the cold ground. Now that same wolf pressed against her ribs like a wounded animal seeking shelter, and Freya understood the impulse. She wanted to curl into herself and disappear. "Look at her!" Someone spat from the crowd. "She doesn't even deny it." Freya's fingers curled into the ash. Deny what? That she had poisoned Luna Alara's womb, destroyed the Alpha's heir before it could draw breath? The accusation was so monstrous, so fundamentally opposed to everything she had dedicated her life to, that words had failed her when Marcus first spoke them aloud. Marcus, her brother, her blood. She lifted her head and found him standing at the front of the mob, his handsome face arranged in an expression of righteous grief. He had their mother's dark hair and their father's sharp cheekbones, and he wore his borrowed name like armor, Marcus Valewood, as if he could shed their shared history by refusing to carry it. He had taken their mother's maiden name when he was 16, the same year Freya had shown her first healing gift, and he had shown none. "The evidence is clear," Marcus said, his voice carrying across the gathered wolves. "My sister's jealousy of the Luna's position drove her to this unspeakable act. I found the poison in her stores myself." "Because you put it there," Freya thought, the knowledge burning hotter than the flames behind her. "I saw the vials in your room. I know what you've been doing." But she had no proof. She had confronted him privately, foolishly, thinking blood would matter more than ambition. She had given him time to prepare, time to turn the pack against her, time to ensure that when the accusation came, it would be her word against his carefully constructed evidence. "I served this pack for 12 years, Freya said, her voice emerging raw from a throat tight with smoke and unshed tears. "I healed your children. I sat with your dying. I mixed every remedy with my own hands and prayed over every patient who came to my door. And we trusted you." The shout came from Henrik, the blacksmith whose daughter Freya had saved from fever just last winter. His face was twisted with betrayal, and Freya felt something crack in her chest at the sight. "We trusted you, and you murdered our Luna's baby." "I didn't—" "Enough." Alpha Caden stepped forward, his gray-streaked hair wild in the firelight. His eyes were red-rimmed, hollow with the grief of a man who had watched his mate bleed and lose the child they had waited decades to conceive. "Freya Shadowfang, you are hereby banished from Silverpine territory. If you are found within our borders after moonrise, you will be executed." Freya's stomach dropped. Banishment. In her condition, in winter's approach, with nothing but the thin dress on her back and the secret growing in her womb. Banishment was a death sentence delivered with cleaner hands. "Alpha, please." She pushed herself to her feet, her legs trembling. "Let me speak. Let me tell you what really—" "You dare?" Luna Alara's voice cut through the night like a blade. She stood beside her mate, pale as bone, her hand pressed to her still flat belly where a child had quickened and died. "You dare ask for a hearing after what you did to me? After you sat by my bed and smiled and fed me poison?" "I never smiled," Freya thought desperately. "I never knew until it was too late. I would have died before I harmed you or your child." But she could see the truth didn't matter. The pack needed someone to blame, and Marcus had given them a perfect target. The healer who had always been too quiet, too strange, too focused on her work to build alliances, the woman whose own brother had found the courage to expose her. Get out, Alpha Caden growled, before I change my mind about giving you until moonrise. Freya looked at the faces of wolves she had known her entire life and found nothing but hatred staring back. Even old Marta, who had taught her to dry herbs when she was 6 years old, stood with her arms crossed and her jaw set. The betrayal was absolute. Her gaze found Marcus one last time. He met her eyes with a small, satisfied smile that no one else could see, a private acknowledgement of his victory. He had wanted her position, her cottage, her reputation. He had wanted everything she had built, and now he would have it. "This isn't over," Freya whispered. The words meant only for him. His smile widened. "Yes, sister, it is." She turned and walked into the darkness of the thornwood, leaving behind the ashes of her life and the wolves who had chosen to believe a lie. The flames crackled behind her, consuming the last of her grandmother's walls, and Freya did not look back. The forest swallowed her whole. She walked until her legs gave out, until the orange glow of the burning cottage faded to nothing behind her, until the only light was the cold silver of the moon filtering through bare branches. The thornwood earned its name. Every step brought new scratches to her arms, new tears in her thin dress, new reminders that she had fled with nothing but the clothes on her back and the child in her belly. The child, Garrett's child. The only piece of him that remained in this world. Freya pressed her hand to her stomach, feeling the gentle curve that was just beginning to show beneath her thin dress. 18 weeks since her last bleeding. 18 weeks since she had realized that her dead mate had left her one final gift. She had told no one. She had barely allowed herself to believe it, still drowning in grief, still struggling to understand how she could carry life when her own felt so empty. Now that secret might be the only thing keeping her going. "We'll survive this," she whispered to the tiny spark of life growing inside her. "I don't know how yet, but we will. I promise you." Her wolf stirred weakly at the words, the first response she had felt from that part of herself since Garrett's death. The bond had shattered when he died, leaving a ragged hole in her soul that nothing could fill. She had thought the grief might kill her. Some nights she had wished it would. But there was the child to think about now. There was a future to fight for, even if that future felt impossibly distant and uncertain. Freya stumbled over a root and caught herself against a tree trunk, her palms scraping against rough bark. The cold was settling into her bones, her thin dress utterly inadequate for a night in the open forest. She needed shelter. She needed food. She needed to keep moving. The Alpha King's territory lay somewhere to the north, beyond the Thornwood's worst tangles. She knew this only because she had studied maps obsessively as a young healer, learning the boundaries of every pack so she would know which herbs grew where. Drake Duskwalker's domain was legendary, vast and powerful, ruled by an alpha who had held his throne for nearly a millennium. He was said to be fair but ruthless, ancient beyond reckoning, and utterly without mercy for those who threatened his wolves. He was also her only chance. If she could reach his border, if she could beg for sanctuary, perhaps she could survive long enough to prove her innocence. Perhaps she could find a way to expose Marcus's crimes before he destroyed anyone else. Perhaps... A howl rose in the distance, and Freya's blood turned to ice. They were hunting her. She had thought banishment meant they would let her go, but she should have known better. Marcus couldn't afford to leave loose ends, not when Freya knew what he had done. He would have convinced Alpha Caden that she was too dangerous to live, or simply organized a hunting party on his own authority. Either way, the message was clear. She was meant to die in these woods. Freya broke into a run. Branches tore at her face and arms, roots conspired to trip her, and her exhausted body screamed for rest she couldn't afford to take. The howls grew closer, multiplying until she could count at least 4 distinct voices in the chorus. A proper hunting party, then. More than enough to bring down one half-starved, grieving healer with no combat training and a wolf too broken to shift. "Please," she begged her wolf, "please, I need you. I need to run." Her wolf uncurled slightly, whimpering with the effort but couldn't summon the strength to surface. The grief had hollowed her out, and weeks of barely eating, barely sleeping had left nothing in reserve. Freya was alone in this chase, purely human, purely vulnerable. She ran anyway. Time lost meaning in the darkness and terror. She knew only the burn of her lungs, the pound of her heart, the endless reaching of her legs for one more step, one more stride, one more desperate surge forward. The howls grew louder. The crashing of pursuit grew closer. She could smell them now, could sense the heat of their bodies cutting through the cold night air. The border, she thought wildly. If I can just reach the border. She burst through a final wall of thorns and found herself in a clearing unlike any she had seen in the Thornwood. The trees here stood straight and ancient, their branches bare but somehow less threatening than the grasping claws behind her. The ground was covered in silver frost that caught the moonlight and threw it back like scattered diamonds. And at the far edge of the clearing stood a stone marker carved with symbols she didn't recognize. The border. She had reached the border of the Alpha King's territory. Freya stumbled forward, her legs finally giving out just as she crossed the invisible line. She fell hard, the frost burning against her scratched palms, her knees cracking against frozen ground. Behind her, she heard the hunters pull up short, their growls frustrated and furious. She made it across, someone snarled. Marcus. She would know his voice anywhere, would hear it in her nightmares for the rest of her life. She actually made it across. We could still... Another voice began. No. Marcus cut him off, and Freya could hear the calculation in his tone. The Alpha King doesn't tolerate border violations. We'll find another way. Footsteps retreated. Howls faded into the distance, and Freya lay in the frost, her breath coming in ragged gasps, her entire body shaking with cold and exhaustion and the aftermath of terror. She had survived. Somehow, impossibly, she had survived. But as the adrenaline drained from her system, the cold began to seep deeper. Her fingers were numb, her lips felt strange and thick. Her eyes grew heavy despite the danger, despite everything. Stay awake, she told herself. You have to stay awake. The last thing she saw before darkness claimed her was a pair of boots approaching through the frost, worn leather that moved with the confident stride of someone who owned every inch of the ground beneath his feet. She tried to lift her head, tried to see the face of whoever had found her, but her body had finally given up. Consciousness slipped away like water through her fingers, and Freya surrendered to the void. She woke to warmth. Not the warmth of her burning cottage, not the heat of pursuit, but something gentler. Furs piled around her body, a fire crackling nearby, the soft glow of candlelight against her closed eyelids. For one confused moment she thought she was home, thought the nightmare had been just that, thought she would open her eyes and find Garrett sleeping beside her, and Marcus's betrayal, nothing but a fever dream. Then memory crashed back, and she gasped, jerking upright in the unfamiliar bed. Easy. The voice came from somewhere to her left, deep and resonant, carrying an authority that her wolf recognized on some instinctive level. Freya's eyes flew open. He sat in a chair beside the door, positioned to guard the only entrance to the room. He was the largest man she had ever seen, not just tall, but broad across the shoulders, built like a warrior who had spent centuries honing his body into a weapon. His hair was dark, almost black, falling in waves to his shoulders. His jaw was sharp, his nose straight, his mouth set in a line that suggested he rarely smiled. His eyes swept over her with clinical assessment, cataloging her injuries, her condition, the slight swell of her belly beneath the borrowed blankets. There was no warmth in that examination, no softness. Just the cold calculation of a king deciding what to do with a trespasser found half dead at his border. Then his gaze met hers, and everything changed. His eyes were amber, shot through with gold, and the moment their gazes locked, the clinical distance shattered. They fixed on her with an intensity that made her feel like the only person in the entire world. She felt her wolf surge forward with a strength that shocked her, rising from the grief-hollowed depths of her soul with a keening cry that reverberated through every fiber of her being. Mate, mate, mate. Heat exploded through Freya's chest like molten gold spreading through frozen veins. She felt it pour down her arms, through her belly, into the very marrow of her bones. Her skin prickled with awareness. Her heart thundered so loudly she was certain he could hear it. The bond, the mate bond she had felt once before with Garrett, but never like this, never with this overwhelming intensity, roared to life between them. Across the room, the man rose to his feet. His eyes had flared brilliant amber, his pupils blown wide, and a growl rumbled from his chest that vibrated through the air like a physical force. His hands clenched at his sides, knuckles going white, and she watched the muscles of his neck cord, with the effort of staying where he was. Impossible, he breathed. Then, with visible effort, he forced his voice to steadiness. You're safe. No one will harm you here. The words seemed directed at himself as much as at her, a reminder of what he was, of the control he had maintained for centuries. Freya couldn't speak. She couldn't move. She could only stare at this stranger who felt more familiar than anyone she had ever known, this man whose presence called to something ancient and primal in her blood. Terror and desperate longing warred in her heart, terror because she had already lost one mate and barely survived it, longing because her wolf was crying out for him with every fiber of her being. They stared at each other for 3 heartbeats, neither breathing. The bond pulsed between them like a living thing. The 4th heartbeat broke the spell. Drake Duskwalker moved first, a single step forward that seemed to cost him more effort than lifting a mountain. His hands unclenched slowly, deliberately, as if he were forcing his body to obey commands his instincts screamed against. The growl still rumbled in his chest, low and constant, a sound Freya felt in her bones rather than heard with her ears. You need to breathe, he said, and the words seemed directed at himself as much as at her. Freya sucked in air, unaware until that moment that she had stopped. The breath shuddered through her, carrying his scent deep into her lungs, pine and wood smoke and something darker, something wild, something that made her wolf keen with longing. She pressed her hand to her chest, feeling her heart hammer against her palm like a caged bird desperate for freedom. What? Her voice cracked. She swallowed and tried again. What is happening? But she knew. Of course she knew. She had felt this before with Garrett, though that bond had been a gentle stream compared to this raging river. The mate bond had chosen her again, impossibly, cruelly, linking her soul to a stranger when the wounds from losing her first mate still bled fresh in her chest. The bond, Drake said, and his voice had roughened, stripped of the calm authority he had shown moments before. The mate bond. I never thought... He stopped, his jaw working, amber eyes blazing with an intensity that made her want to shrink back into the furs, even as her wolf urged her forward. In 900 years, I never thought I would feel this. 900 years. The words echoed through Freya's mind, but she couldn't process them. She couldn't process anything beyond the heat spreading through her veins, the way her wolf was clawing to get closer to him, the desperate war between terror and desire that threatened to tear her apart. I can't, she whispered. I can't do this again. I lost... The words caught in her throat like broken glass. I lost my mate 4 months ago. The bond shattered. It nearly killed me. I can't... Pain flickered across Drake's face, there and gone so quickly she might have imagined it. He took another step forward, then stopped himself with visible effort, his hands curling into fists again at his sides. You were mated before? It wasn't a question, but she nodded anyway, tears burning behind her eyes. Garrett. His name was Garrett. He died in a border skirmish with rogues. I felt it happen. Felt our bond snap like a thread cut with shears. I thought I would die too. Some nights I wished I had. Drake was silent for a long moment, his amber eyes searching her face with an intensity that should have been frightening. Instead, Freya found herself leaning toward him unconsciously, her wolf straining against her control, desperate to close the distance between them. "The fates are cruel," he said finally, his voice low and rough. "To give you a bond and tear it away. To give you another when the wounds are still bleeding." His eyes flashed brighter gold, and she saw something fierce and protective kindle in their depths. "But I will not add to your pain. I will not force anything you do not freely give." The words struck her like a physical blow. She had expected— what had she expected? Demands. Claims. An alpha king seizing what the bond had declared his by right. She had heard stories of alphas who took their mates the moment the bond snapped into place, who saw the claiming as their due regardless of their mate's wishes. Instead, this ancient, powerful wolf was standing across the room from her, holding himself back with white-knuckled restraint, offering her a choice that most alphas would never dream of giving. "You're the Alpha King," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Drake Duskwalker." Something that might have been amusement flickered in his eyes, though his expression remained grave. "You've heard of me. Everyone has heard of you. They say you're ruthless. They say you've killed more wolves than any alpha in living memory. They say—" She stopped, suddenly aware of how foolish she sounded, lying in his bed wrapped in his furs and reciting rumors about his cruelty. "They say many things." Drake's voice was soft, but there was an edge to it now, a weariness that spoke of centuries weathering gossip and fear. "Most of them are true. I have been ruthless when ruthlessness was required. I have killed when killing was necessary. I have done terrible things in service of my pack and my territory." He paused, his amber eyes burning into hers. "But I have never forced myself on anyone. I have never taken what was not offered. And I will not start with you, little wolf, no matter what the bond demands of me." Little wolf. The endearment sent warmth cascading through her chest, and Freya bit her lip hard enough to taste copper. Her wolf was purring now, settling in her chest like a contented cat, and she wanted to scream at the traitorous creature to remember Garrett, to remember what losing a mate had cost them, to remember that trusting this stranger could destroy them all over again. But her wolf only purred louder, pressing against her ribs with an insistence she couldn't ignore. "I don't know what to do," Freya admitted, her voice breaking on the words. "I don't know how to feel this again. I don't know how to let myself—" "Then don't." Drake cut her off, his voice gentle despite its firmness. "Don't decide anything tonight. Don't feel anything you're not ready to feel. You're exhausted, you're hunted, you're grieving, and you're—" He stopped abruptly, his nostrils flaring, and Freya's blood ran cold. "He knows." The thought screamed through her mind. He can smell it. He knows about the baby. But Drake only closed his eyes for a moment, something complicated and painful crossing his features before his expression smoothed back into that calm, controlled mask. When he opened his eyes again, the amber had dimmed slightly, and he seemed more in command of himself. "You need rest," he said. "We will speak more in the morning, when you've slept and eaten and had time to think. For now, know this: you are under my protection. Whatever brought you fleeing into the thornwood with hunters at your heels, whatever you're running from, it cannot touch you here. I swear it on my blood and my throne." The vow settled over her like a blanket, and Freya felt something loosen in her chest that had been wound tight since the moment she saw flames consuming her cottage. She was safe. For the first time since Marcus's accusation, for the first time since the mob had gathered with their torches and their hatred, she was safe. Tears spilled down her cheeks before she could stop them. Drake made a sound low in his throat. Not quite a growl, not quite a whimper, and took another step toward her before catching himself. His hands flexed at his sides, and Freya could see the war playing out across his features, the bond screaming at him to go to her, to comfort her, to claim her as his own, and his iron will holding himself back. "Sleep," he said roughly. "I'll be here. Nothing will harm you while I watch." He lowered himself back into the chair by the door, his massive frame somehow folding into the too small seat, and turned his amber eyes toward the entrance. The message was clear. He would guard her through the night, asking nothing in return. Freya wanted to say something. "Thank you. I'm sorry. I don't know how to trust you yet." But the words tangled in her throat, and exhaustion was pulling at her with insistent hands, dragging her back down into the warmth of the furs. The last thing she saw before sleep claimed her was Drake's profile silhouetted against the firelight, watchful and steady as a sentinel carved from stone. And despite everything, despite her grief, despite her terror, despite the impossibility of finding her mate again so soon after losing one, she felt safer than she had in months. Something golden and fragile stretched between them as darkness took her, a promise and a question all at once. She slept without dreams. Freya woke to pale morning light filtering through tall windows, and for a disorienting moment she couldn't remember where she was. The bed was too soft, the furs were too warm, the ceiling was too high, carved with intricate patterns of running wolves that seemed to move in the shifting light. Then memory returned in a rush. The fire, the flight, the border, and Drake Duskwalker's amber eyes burning into hers as the mate bond roared to life between them. She sat up slowly, her body aching with the aftermath of her desperate run through the thornwood. Every scratch and bruise made itself known, and her stomach cramped with hunger so intense it bordered on pain. When had she last eaten? She couldn't remember. Sometime before Marcus's accusation, before her world fell apart. The chair by the door was empty. Freya's heart clenched with something that felt horrifyingly like disappointment, and she ruthlessly crushed the feeling. She had known him for mere hours. She had no right to miss his presence, no right to feel abandoned by his absence. But her wolf whined softly, nosing at the edges of her consciousness, searching for the thread of the bond that connected them. It was still there. She could feel it now that she reached for it, a golden filament stretching out from her chest toward somewhere deeper in this building. He hadn't gone far. He was somewhere nearby, his presence a warm weight at the edge of her awareness. The realization that she could sense him so easily after only one night terrified her. A soft knock came at the door, and Freya's wolf perked up eagerly before subsiding with a disappointed huff. Not him. The scent that drifted under the door was feminine, soft, tinged with flower and herbs. "Come in," Freya called, her voice rough with sleep. The door opened to reveal a plump, gray-haired woman carrying a tray laden with food. She had kind eyes and a warm smile, and she moved with the comfortable efficiency of someone who had spent decades caring for others. "Good morning, dear," the woman said, setting the tray on a table near the bed. "I'm Mira, head of the household staff. His Majesty asked me to bring you breakfast and see to your needs." Her eyes swept over Freya with professional assessment. "You look like you haven't had a proper meal in days. Eat first, then we'll get you bathed and dressed in something more suitable." Freya looked down at herself and winced. Her thin dress was torn and filthy, stained with ash and mud, and blood from countless scratches. She must have looked like a wild creature when Drake found her, half dead and feral and utterly pathetic. The thought of him seeing her like that made her face flush with embarrassment. "Thank you," she managed, reaching for the tray with hands that trembled with hunger. The food was simple, but abundant. Fresh bread still warm from the oven, butter and honey, sliced fruit, thick slabs of ham, a pot of tea that steamed fragrant in the cool morning air. Freya fell upon it with a desperation that would have shamed her a week ago, when she still had dignity and a home and a life that made sense. Mira watched her eat with a satisfaction that bordered on maternal, refilling her teacup and pushing more bread toward her whenever she slowed. "Poor thing," the older woman murmured. "What those wolves did to you. Burning your home while you fled for your life. It's unconscionable." Freya froze with a piece of ham halfway to her mouth. "You know what happened? His Majesty told us the broad strokes this morning, said you were a healer from Silverpine, falsely accused and driven out by your own pack." Mira's eyes hardened with anger. Said your own brother led the mob. The ham turned to ash in Freya's mouth. She set down her fork, her appetite suddenly gone. He told you all that? He wanted us to understand, wanted us to know that you were to be treated with the utmost respect and care. Mira leaned forward, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. Between you and me, dear, I've served His Majesty for 40 years, and I've never seen him like this. Never seen him watch over someone all night without closing his eyes. Never heard him threaten to gut anyone who speaks ill of a guest in his home. Freya's heart stuttered. He threatened to... Lord Vance made a comment at breakfast about pack refugees and desperate females who would do anything for sanctuary. Mira's smile turned sharp with remembered satisfaction. His Majesty had him pinned to the wall by his throat before the words finished leaving his mouth. Told him that you were under the king's personal protection, and anyone who questioned your honor would be questioning his. The room seemed to spin around Freya. She gripped the edge of the table, trying to steady herself, trying to make sense of what she was hearing. Drake Duskwalker, the ruthless Alpha King, had defended her to his own court, had threatened violence on her behalf, had stayed awake through the night to guard her sleep. Why? She whispered. Why would he do that for a stranger? Mira's expression softened into something knowing, something almost wistful. You'll have to ask him that yourself, dear, but I suspect... She paused, choosing her words carefully. I suspect His Majesty has waited a very long time for someone worth protecting. Before Freya could respond, another knock came at the door. This time, her wolf surged forward so forcefully that she gasped, the bond flaring with golden warmth in her chest. That'll be him, Mira said, rising with a smile. I'll leave you two to talk. Call if you need anything. She opened the door, bobbed a curtsy to whoever stood on the other side, and slipped away. And then Drake was there, filling the doorway with his massive frame, his amber eyes finding Freya's immediately as if drawn by a magnet. He looked different in the daylight. Less otherworldly, more human, though no less imposing. He wore simple dark clothing that did nothing to disguise the power coiled in his muscles, and his dark hair was pulled back from his face, revealing the sharp planes of his cheekbones and jaw. He looked tired, Freya realized. There were shadows under his eyes that hadn't been there last night. Because he stayed awake, she thought. Because he watched over me instead of sleeping. May I enter? He asked, and the formality of the question, as if she had any right to deny the Alpha King access to a room in his own home, made something warm unfurl in her chest. Of course. He stepped inside, closing the door behind him, and immediately the room felt smaller. His presence seemed to fill every corner, pressing against her awareness with the weight of centuries and power beyond imagining. But there was nothing threatening in the way he moved, nothing predatory. He kept his distance, positioning himself near the window where the morning light could catch the amber of his eyes. You slept, he said. Good. You didn't. Something flickered in his expression. Surprise, maybe, that she had noticed. I'll rest later. I needed to... He stopped, his jaw tightening. I needed to ensure you were safe. The words hung between them, weighted with everything unsaid. The connection between them reached out, soft and insistent, trying to bridge the distance, and Freya felt her wolf stretching toward him like a flower towards sunlight. Mira told me what happened at breakfast, she said quietly, with Lord Vance. Drake's eyes flashed darker gold. He had no right to speak of you that way. He doesn't know me. None of them do. I'm just a stranger who collapsed at your border. You are not just anything. The words came out rough, almost growled, and Drake closed his eyes briefly as if seeking control. When he opened them again, the amber had softened slightly. Forgive me. The bond makes it difficult to hear you diminish yourself. Freya stared at him, her heart pounding. She had expected many things from the legendary Alpha King: cruelty, indifference, perhaps a cold political calculation about how she could be used. She had not expected this fierce protectiveness, this barely restrained tenderness that seemed to confuse him as much as it confused her. "You don't know me either," she said softly. "You don't know if I'm worth protecting. For all you know, my brother's accusations were true. For all you know, I did poison. You didn't." Drake's voice was absolute, certain in a way that made her breath catch. "I've watched guilty wolves for 9 centuries. I know the scent of lies and the taste of evil. You have neither." He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice was gentler. "And I know what it is to be betrayed by blood. I know what it costs to have family turn against you." There was old pain in his words, ancient grief carefully controlled, but not forgotten. Freya wanted to ask, wanted to know what had happened to him, what betrayals he had survived, what had carved that sorrow into the depths of his amber eyes. But it was too soon. They were still strangers, still circling each other like wolves unsure whether to fight or flee. The bond urged her closer, whispered that she could trust him, promised that he would never hurt her. But Freya had learned the hard way that bonds could break and trust could shatter, and the people you loved most could destroy you without a second thought. "I need time," she said finally, forcing the words past the lump in her throat. "To understand this, to understand what the bond means for both of us. I can't just accept it blindly, not after everything." Drake nodded slowly, and she saw relief mix with disappointment in his expression. "I would never ask you to. Take all the time you need. I will wait." The last 2 words carried a weight that made her shiver. "I will wait." As if he had been waiting all along, for centuries, for her specifically. As if his patience was infinite and his devotion already certain. It should have frightened her. It did frighten her. But underneath the fear, buried deep where she barely dared to acknowledge it, was something else entirely. Hope. "Thank you," she whispered, "for saving me, for protecting me, for giving me time." Drake crossed the room in 3 strides, stopping just close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from his body, smell the pine and wood smoke scent that made her wolf purr with contentment. He reached out slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, and brushed his fingers against her cheek with a tenderness that stole her breath. "You gave me something too," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "You woke something in me that I thought died centuries ago. Whatever time you need, whatever space you require, it's yours. But know this, Freya Shadowfang." His amber eyes blazed with intensity. "You are mine, as I am yours. Not because I claim you, but because the fates have bound our souls together. And I will spend every moment from now until eternity proving myself worthy of that bond." Then he stepped back, inclining his head in a gesture of respect that looked almost foreign on such a powerful alpha, and left her alone with her racing heart and her singing wolf, and the terrifying, exhilarating realization that maybe, just maybe, she had found something worth living for after all. The door closed softly behind him. Freya pressed her hand to her chest, feeling the mate bond pulse with golden warmth, and allowed herself to believe, just for a moment, that she might survive this after all. That night, alone in the dark, she finally let herself think about Garrett. Not the sharp, stabbing grief that had consumed her for months, but something softer, a quiet remembering of the man who had first taught her what it meant to be loved. "I'm sorry," she whispered to the empty room, to the memory of gentle hands and patient eyes. "I never thought I could feel this again. I never wanted to." But even as she said it, she understood what Garrett would have told her if he could. He had always wanted her happiness above all else. He would not have wanted her to spend the rest of her life as a ghost, haunting the ruins of what they'd shared. He would have wanted her to live. The tears that fell were not tears of guilt, she realized. They were tears of release, of finally allowing herself to acknowledge that loving Drake did not mean forgetting Garrett. Her heart was not betraying one mate by accepting another. It was simply learning, slowly and painfully, how to hold both. When she finally slept, she dreamed of Garrett's face, not twisted in death as she had seen it so many times before, but smiling, peaceful, his hand raised in farewell. And when she woke, the grief had not vanished, but it had gentled into something she could carry without breaking. The warmth of the mate bond still pulsed against her palm when the first knock came at her door 3 days later. Freya had spent those days in a strange, suspended state, caught between healing and hoping, between the terror of her past and the terrifying possibility of her future. Drake had kept his word. He had given her space, though she sensed him nearby always. Felt the bond tugging gently whenever he passed her corridor on his way to council meetings or training grounds. The servants brought her meals with quiet efficiency, never staying long enough to make her uncomfortable, but always leaving with warm smiles that suggested the Alpha King had made her comfort a priority throughout his household. She had begun to eat properly again, her body slowly remembering what it meant to nourish herself and the child growing within her. The palace healers had visited twice, gentle wolves who examined her with careful hands and pronounced both her and the baby healthy despite the trauma she had endured. They never asked about the father, never looked at her with judgment or curiosity, and Freya wondered if Drake had spoken to them beforehand, had warned them to treat her with nothing but respect. The thought made her chest ache with something dangerously close to affection. But now someone was knocking, and when she called for them to enter, she found not a servant but a tall, severe-looking woman with silver-streaked black hair and eyes the color of winter ice. "Lady Shadowfang," the woman said, her voice cool and measured. "I am Counselor Elspeth Ravencrest. I oversee diplomatic relations for the Alpha King's court." Freya rose from her chair by the window, instinctively straightening despite the lingering weakness in her limbs. "Counselor, how may I help you?" Elspeth's gaze swept over her, taking in the borrowed dress, one of many that had appeared in her wardrobe without explanation, all in deep blues and greens that complemented her coloring, and the slight curve of her belly beneath the flowing fabric. Something flickered in those cold eyes, but it vanished before Freya could name it. "I've come to inform you that we have received an embassy from Silverpine Pack," Elspeth said, and the words fell into the room like stones into still water. "They sent word by Messenger Hawk 5 days ago, and arrived this morning after hard travel through the Thornwood. They seek an audience with the Alpha King regarding what they call a matter of pack justice." The floor seemed to tilt beneath Freya's feet. She gripped the back of her chair, knuckles going white, as ice flooded through her veins where the mate bond's warmth had been moments before. "Silverpine," she repeated, her voice barely a whisper. Who leads this embassy?" "A wolf named Marcus Valewood. He claims to be a healer of some standing, newly appointed to the Pack's inner council. Alpha Caden sent him as his official voice. Apparently your brother convinced him that only family could properly identify and retrieve you." Elspeth's expression remained impassive, but her eyes were sharp, watching Freya's reaction with calculated interest. "He also claims to have come reluctantly, driven by duty rather than desire, that he takes no pleasure in hunting his own sister." Marcus. The name hit her like a physical blow, driving the air from her lungs and sending her wolf into a frenzy of terror and rage. Marcus was here. Marcus had followed her across territories, had tracked her to the one place she had thought herself safe, had come with his lies and his poison and his endless, consuming ambition to drag her back into his web of destruction. "He's not here for justice," Freya heard herself say, her voice sounding distant and strange. "He's the one he poisoned the Luna. He killed her. He framed me to cover his crimes." Elspeth's eyebrow arched slightly. "Those are serious accusations." "They're the truth." Freya forced herself to meet the counselor's gaze, to let her see the absolute certainty burning in her eyes. "Marcus wanted my position as pack healer. He wanted my bloodline for his own purposes. When our Luna began having trouble conceiving, he saw his opportunity. He poisoned her slowly, carefully, making it look like a wasting sickness. And when she lost her baby, he blamed me." The words poured out of her now. All the terror and betrayal she had swallowed during her flight through the thornwoods spilling forth like blood from a wound. He turned my own pack against me. He burned my home while I was still inside it. He would have watched me die screaming if I hadn't escaped through the back window. Her hand moved unconsciously to her belly, cradling the slight swell where new life grew. He would have killed my child. Elspeth was silent for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then she said, very quietly, "The Alpha King believes you." Freya's breath caught. "He does?" "He made his position quite clear when the embassy was announced this morning. I have rarely seen him so emphatic. A ghost of something. Amusement? Respect?" Flickered across Elspeth's severe features. "He informed the council that you are under his protection, and that any attempt to remove you from his territory would be considered an act of war. He also stated that he finds Marcus Valewood's claims suspect and intends to investigate them thoroughly before any diplomatic decisions are made." Relief washed through Freya, so intense that her knees nearly buckled. Drake believed her. Despite knowing her for only days, despite having nothing but her word against Marcus's carefully crafted lies, he had taken her side without hesitation. She felt him through their connection. Drake, somewhere in the palace, sensing her distress and responding with a pulse of answering warmth that settled her racing heart. But beneath the relief, cold fear still coiled in her gut. "Marcus is dangerous," she said, meeting Elspeth's eyes again. "More dangerous than you know. He's clever and patient and completely without conscience. If he's come all this way, it's because he has a plan, and that plan won't end with simply asking for my return." Elspeth studied her for a long moment. Then, unexpectedly, she nodded. "I suspected as much. There was something in his manner during the initial meeting, a quality I have learned to recognize after decades of dealing with ambitious wolves." She paused, and when she spoke again, her voice was almost gentle. "You should know that the Alpha King has posted additional guards outside your chambers, and he has requested that you join him for dinner this evening, if you feel strong enough. He believes it would be wise for you to know everything we've learned about your brother's embassy." Freya swallowed hard. Dinner with Drake, sitting across from him, feeling the bond pulse between them, trying to focus on political machinations while her wolf sang and her heart raced. It should have seemed impossible to worry about such things when Marcus was lurking somewhere in the palace, plotting her destruction. But somehow, facing Drake felt almost as frightening as facing her brother. "Tell him I'll be there," she said. Elspeth inclined her head and swept from the room, leaving Freya alone with her thundering heart and her racing thoughts. Marcus was here, the wolf who had destroyed everything she loved, who had burned her home and murdered an innocent Luna and turned her own pack into a howling mob. He was somewhere in this palace, breathing the same air, walking the same halls. And he wanted her back. Or dead. Because as long as Freya lived, she remained a threat. The only witness to his crimes, the only one who could expose the truth about what he had done to the Luna. His position in Silverpine was built on a lie, and lies had a way of unraveling when the truth was still breathing. Worse, she was pregnant. If she raised Garrett's child in safety, that child would grow up knowing the truth, would grow up hungry for justice, would become a threat Marcus couldn't eliminate without revealing himself. He couldn't let someone else handle this. He needed to see her dead with his own eyes, needed to control every detail of how this ended. That was Marcus, never trusting anyone else to do what he considered his work. She knew with bone-deep certainty that he wouldn't stop until he had what he wanted. Marcus had never accepted defeat, had never been able to tolerate being thwarted. When they were children, he had once pursued a grudge against another pup for 3 years, patient and methodical, until he finally found a way to make the other boys suffer for the imagined slight. That was Marcus, willing to wait, willing to plan, willing to do whatever it took to achieve his goals. And now his goal was her. Freya moved to the window, looking out over the palace grounds without really seeing them. Her hand pressed against the glass, cool against her palm, and she tried to steady her breathing. She had to think, had to remember everything she knew about Marcus, everything that might help Drake and his council see through her brother's deceptions. Marcus was charming when he wanted to be, smooth and convincing, with a healer's bedside manner that made people trust him instinctively. He would have prepared his story carefully, would have rehearsed every detail of his lies until they sounded like absolute truth. He would present himself as the concerned brother, the loyal pack member, the voice of justice seeking only to right a terrible wrong. And underneath it all, he would be plotting murder, because that was the only way this could end, Freya realized with sudden sickening clarity. Marcus couldn't let her live. She knew too much, had witnessed too much of his crimes. As long as she breathed, she was a threat to everything he had built. The position, the power, the future he was so determined to claim. He would smile and bow and play the diplomat, but in the shadows, he would be searching for a way to silence her permanently. And if Drake continued to protect her, Marcus would eventually decide that the Alpha King needed to be silenced too. The thought sent ice through her veins. Drake was powerful, one of the most powerful alphas in living memory, but Marcus was cunning in ways that had nothing to do with strength. He had spent years as a healer, learning about poisons and dosages and all the ways a body could be made to fail. He knew secrets that most wolves never dreamed of, dark knowledge he had gathered through research and experimentation, always careful, always covering his tracks. If Marcus decided that Drake was an obstacle, he wouldn't challenge him directly. He would find another way. Poison in wine, a treated blade during sparring, something slow and subtle that would look like natural causes until it was far too late. Freya pressed her forehead against the cool glass and closed her eyes. She had brought this danger to Drake's door. By fleeing to his territory, by stumbling across his border and triggering the mate bond, she had painted a target on his back. Marcus would never let the Alpha King keep her, not when she represented everything he wanted. Her healing bloodline, her knowledge of his crimes, her very existence as a reminder of his failures. She should leave. The thought slid through her mind like poison, bitter and seductive. She should slip away in the night, disappear into the wilderness, draw Marcus away from this place, and the male who had shown her nothing but kindness. It would be the noble thing to do, the selfless thing, the thing that a good person would do to protect someone they cared about. But even as she thought it, her wolf snarled in furious rejection. Leave, mate? Never. Never. The bond flared in her chest, hot and insistent, and she felt an answering pulse from somewhere deep in the palace. Drake, sensing her turmoil, reaching out through their connection with wordless comfort. She couldn't leave him. The mere thought sent pain lancing through her chest, made her wolf howl with anguish. 3 days. She had known him for 3 days, and already the idea of separation was unthinkable. This was the power of the mate bond, the ancient magic that bound two souls together across all obstacles, and for the first time, Freya understood why wolves who lost their mates often didn't survive the grief. She had barely survived losing Garrett. She would not survive losing Drake. So she had to fight instead. Had to find a way to expose Marcus's lies before he could carry out whatever dark scheme he had brought to this palace. Had to protect Drake as fiercely as he had protected her, even if it meant facing down the monster who wore her brother's face. The door opened behind her, and she knew without turning who it was. The bond sang in recognition, warmth flooding through her veins, and her wolf settled into contented stillness, despite the fear still churning in her gut. Elspeth told me she informed you about the embassy, Drake said, his deep voice carrying an edge of carefully controlled anger. I came to make sure you were all right. Freya turned from the window to face him. He stood in the doorway, his massive frame filling the space, his amber eyes burning with protective intensity. She could feel his emotions through the bond, fury at Marcus for daring to come here, concern for her well-being, and underneath it all, a fierce determination to keep her safe no matter the cost. I'm frightened, she admitted, surprised by her own honesty. Marcus is... You don't know what he's capable of. what he's done. Drake crossed the room in 3 strides, stopping just close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from his body. He didn't touch her, never touched her without permission, always giving her the choice. But his presence surrounded her like a shield, and some of the ice in her veins began to thaw. "Tell me," he said. "Tell me everything." And so she did. She told him about growing up with Marcus, about the charming boy who had hidden cruelty behind bright smiles and clever words. She told him about their mother's death when they were young and how Marcus had changed afterward, becoming harder, colder, more focused on accumulating power than on healing the wolves who came to him for help. She told him about the day she discovered what he was doing to the Luna, the horror of realizing that her own brother was slowly murdering an innocent woman to advance his position. She told him about the confrontation, about Marcus's cold fury when she threatened to expose him, about the lies he had spun to turn the pack against her. She told him about the mob at her door, the flames consuming everything she had built, the desperate flight through the thornwood with smoke still stinging her eyes and her brother's howls of triumph ringing in her ears. Drake listened in silence, his expression growing darker with each word. By the time she finished, his eyes had shifted to pure amber, his wolf barely contained beneath the surface. "He comes to my territory seeking justice," Drake said, his voice a low growl that made her shiver. "He speaks of pack law and righteous punishment. And all the while, he carries the blood of an innocent on his hands and the ashes of his sister's home on his soul." "He'll be convincing," Freya warned. "He's had years to practice his lies. The Silverpine Alpha believed him without question, trusted him completely. Marcus knows how to make people see what he wants them to see." Drake reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and cupped her face in his large hands. The touch sent electricity singing through her veins, and she felt the mate bond flare with sudden intensity, warmth and safety and something deeper, something that felt terrifyingly like love. "I am not some young alpha easily swayed by pretty words," Drake said, his amber eyes holding hers. "I have ruled for centuries. I have seen every form of deception, every kind of betrayal that wolves are capable of. Your brother may be clever, but he is not clever enough to fool me. You can't trust anyone around him," Freya whispered, leaning into his touch despite herself. "He uses poison. Subtle things that mimic illness, that leave no trace. He could—" "I have already ordered all food and drink to be tested before consumption," Drake interrupted gently. "And I have placed watchers on him. Wolves he will never detect, reporting his every move. He is being given enough freedom to feel comfortable, enough rope to hang himself." A dangerous smile curved his lips. "Let him plot. Let him scheme. Every step he takes brings him closer to exposing his own crimes." Freya stared up at him, this ancient, powerful alpha who had appointed himself her protector, and felt something crack open in her chest. Not the mate bond. That had been open since the moment their eyes met at the border. This was something else. This was her own heart, finally beginning to believe that she might not have to face this nightmare alone. "Why?" she asked, her voice breaking slightly. "Why do all this for me? You could turn me over to him, avoid conflict with Silverpine entirely. I'm just one wolf, one pregnant, half-starved refugee who collapsed on your doorstep. Why risk war for me?" Drake's thumbs stroked gently across her cheekbones, and she watched emotion flicker across his strong features, tenderness and fierce possession and something that looked almost like wonder. "You are not just one wolf," he said quietly. "You are my mate. Mine, as I am yours. And I would burn every pack in existence to ashes before I let anyone harm you." He leaned forward, pressing his forehead to hers in a gesture of intimate connection that made her breath catch. The mate bond sang between them, golden and warm, and for a moment, everything else fell away. Marcus, the danger, the fear. There was only Drake, his breath warm against her skin, his hands cradling her face like she was something precious. "I spent 9 centuries numb," he murmured, 9 centuries feeling nothing, wanting nothing, waiting without knowing what I waited for. And then, you opened your eyes, and I understood. You are what I waited for. You are why I survived every battle, every betrayal, every lonely century. So no, little wolf, I will not give you up. Not to your brother. Not to anyone. You are mine to protect now, and I protect what is mine. The confrontation came 3 days later when Freya had finally allowed herself to believe that perhaps everything would be resolved peacefully. She had been walking in the castle gardens, one hand resting on the gentle swell of her belly, while the other trailed along the frost-touched roses that somehow bloomed year-round in Drake's territory. The morning air was crisp and clean, carrying the scent of pine and snow and the distant smoke of cooking fires from the village below. She had been thinking about the future, a dangerous indulgence perhaps, but one she couldn't seem to help. A warmth glowed steadily in her chest, a constant reminder that she was no longer alone, and for the first time since Garrett's death, she had allowed herself to imagine what her life might look like in a year, in 5 years, in decades. She never heard Marcus approach. One moment she was alone among the roses, and the next, a hand clamped over her mouth while an arm wrapped around her waist, dragging her backward into the shadows of the garden wall. The scent hit her immediately. Familiar and wrong, the brother she had once loved twisted into something monstrous by ambition and cruelty. "Quiet now, sister," Marcus whispered against her ear, his breath hot and sour. "We wouldn't want to cause a scene." For just a moment, a fraction of a heartbeat, his grip softened, and she heard something almost like grief in his voice. "It didn't have to be this way, you know. If you had just shared your gifts with me, if Mother had taught us both instead of favoring you, I didn't want to become this, Freya. You made me." The grief vanished as quickly as it had appeared, replaced by cold purpose. Terror flooded through her, sharp and cold, and she felt her wolf surge forward with a snarl of protective rage. But Marcus pressed something against her neck, a blade, she realized, coated with something that made her skin burn even through the thin layer of contact. "Wolfsbane," he confirmed, as if reading her thoughts. "Enough to paralyze you for hours if it enters your bloodstream, so I suggest you cooperate." He dragged her deeper into the gardens, away from the main pathways where guards might patrol. Freya's mind raced, trying to understand how this had happened. Drake had said he was watching Marcus, that nothing would escape his notice. But here was her brother. His arm locked around her like a vice, a poisoned blade at her throat. "The Watchers were easy enough to evade," Marcus said, answering her unspoken question. "Your Alpha King is clever, I'll grant him that. But he's also predictable. He watches the obvious places, my quarters, the Great Hall, the kitchens. He never thought to watch the servants' passages or to wonder why one of his own maids might be open to persuasion." Bile rose in Freya's throat. "You killed her. Whoever helped you, you killed her when you were done. Such a suspicious mind you have." Marcus's grip tightened painfully. "But yes, of course I did. Loose ends are so terribly inconvenient." He guided her around a corner, and she saw that they were approaching a small gate in the garden wall, a servant's entrance that she had never noticed before. "I had hoped to handle this more elegantly. A bit of poison in your morning tea, perhaps? Or an unfortunate fall down a staircase. But your mate watches you too closely, and I find myself running out of patience." "What do you want?" Freya managed to ask, though the words came out thick with fear. "What I've always wanted," Marcus replied, pushing her through the gate and into a narrow alley between the outer wall and the forest beyond. "Power. Position. Everything that should have been mine by right, until you came along with your gifts and your gentle heart and your infuriating refusal to use your abilities properly." His voice twisted with old bitterness, old rage. "Mother loved you best. The pack elders praised you while they barely acknowledged me. Even when you married that pathetic Omega, you still outshone me at every turn." He shoved her forward, and Freya stumbled, barely catching herself before she fell. When she turned to face him, she saw that Marcus had positioned himself between her and the gate, his wolfsbane blade gleaming in the morning light. Behind him, two other wolves emerged from the shadows. Silverpine wolves, she realized, their eyes flat and hungry. "You're going to come back to Silverpine with me," Marcus said, his voice taking on the smooth, reasonable tone she remembered from childhood, the voice he used when he was at his most dangerous. "You're going to confess to murdering the Luna, accept your punishment gracefully, and then you're going to spend the rest of your life breeding pups for our pack. Your bloodline is too valuable to waste on one child, sister. Think of what we could accomplish with a dozen wolves carrying your healing gift." Horror washed through her, so intense that for a moment she couldn't breathe. Not just for herself, she had faced death before and survived, but for the child growing inside her, for the future that Marcus was describing with such casual cruelty. "No." The word came out steadier than she expected. "I won't go with you." Marcus smiled, the expression making his handsome face into something ugly. "I wasn't asking." He lunged forward, blade extended, and Freya moved without thinking. She threw herself to the side, feeling the wolfsbane slice through the air inches from her neck, and screamed, not in fear, but in rage, pushing every ounce of desperate strength into the sound. The mate bond flared like a signal fire in her chest. Through their connection, she felt Drake react, felt his instant alarm, his fury, his wolf surging forward with killing intent. She felt him turn and run, faster than should have been possible, his power building like a storm about to break. But Marcus was already moving again, and Drake was too far away, and the other Silverpine wolves were advancing with hungry grins. Freya backed up until she felt the rough bark of a tree against her spine. Her heart was pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears, and her wolf was howling inside her, desperate to shift and fight. But the shift would take precious seconds she didn't have, and even in wolf form, she couldn't fight 3 wolves alone. Then Marcus made a mistake. He reached for her, his fingers closing around her arm, and the contact sent a jolt through her healing gift. A jolt of wrongness, of poison, of sickness that ran deeper than the wolfsbane on his blade. She felt the darkness inside him, the corruption that years of cruelty and murder had bred into his very essence. And she realized, with sudden clarity, that her gift didn't have to work in only one direction. "Stop," she said, and poured her power into the word. Not healing power, not this time. This time, she reached for every toxin that Marcus had put into his body over the years. The wolfsbane he had built up immunity to, the poisons he had handled so often that traces remained in his blood. The sickness of a soul that had chosen evil again and again, until evil was all that remained. She pulled it all to the surface. Marcus's eyes went wide with shock as his own poisons turned against him. His grip on her arm loosened, and he staggered backward, clutching at his chest where she could feel his heart beginning to stutter. "What?" he gasped. "What are you?" "I'm not weak," Freya said, and her voice sounded strange to her own ears, harder than it had ever been, edged with a fury she hadn't known she possessed. "I never was. I just never had a reason to stop being merciful before." The other Silverpine wolves had frozen, staring at their leader as he sank to his knees. One of them started forward, but a thunderous roar split the air. And suddenly, Drake was there, bursting through the garden gate in half-shifted form, his eyes blazing amber and his claws extended for killing. He tore through the first wolf without slowing, and the second turned to flee but made it only 3 steps before Drake caught him by the throat and threw him against the wall with a crack of breaking bones. Then Drake was beside her, his massive form positioning itself between her and Marcus, and Freya felt herself sag with relief. She hadn't realized how much energy she had been expending until Drake's presence allowed her to stop, to let someone else carry the weight of protection for just a moment. "Freya." Drake's voice was rough with barely contained fury, but his hand was gentle as it cupped her face. "Are you hurt? Did he?" "I'm fine," she said, though her voice was shaking. "He didn't cut me." "Drake, A sound from behind Drake made them both turn. Marcus was trying to rise, his face twisted with hatred and pain. The wolfsbane blade was still in his hand, and even weakened by his own poisons, he was lunging forward with it aimed at Drake's unprotected back. But Drake had heard him, and Drake was faster. He spun, catching Marcus's wrist in one massive hand and squeezing until bones cracked and the blade fell to the ground. "You burned your sister's home while she carried a child," Drake growled, his amber eyes boring into Marcus's with centuries of lethal intent. Marcus spat at Drake's feet, his face contorted with defiance. "She was always too weak to deserve our bloodline. Our mother wasted her gifts on a daughter who would never use them properly. I should have been—" Freya stepped forward, cutting off his words. She could feel the poison still churning inside him, responding to her will, but she had pulled back her power when Drake arrived. She hadn't wanted to be the one to end this, hadn't wanted to carry that weight. But looking at Marcus now, seeing the hatred in his eyes, and knowing that he would never stop, that he would spend whatever remained of his life plotting to destroy everything she loved, she understood that mercy wasn't always kindness. Sometimes, mercy was just another word for cowardice. "I was never weak, Marcus," she said, and her voice was steady now. "I was merciful. I loved you despite everything you did, because you were my brother and I believed there was still good in you somewhere." She stepped closer, close enough to see the fear that flickered beneath his hatred. "But you burned that belief when you burned my home. You killed it when you murdered an innocent woman and blamed me for your crime. And now—" She looked at Drake, finding his amber eyes fixed on her with something like awe. "Now I'm done being merciful." She nodded, and Drake's hand tightened around Marcus's throat. For a moment, Marcus struggled, a futile, desperate thrashing that accomplished nothing against Drake's superior strength. Then Drake's claws extended, and with a single savage motion, he tore out Marcus's throat. Blood sprayed across the snow, and Marcus Valewood fell, his eyes glazing over as the life left them. He hit the ground in a crumpled heap, and Freya felt nothing but a cold, clean relief. It was over. The danger that had haunted her for weeks, the shadow that had followed her since she fled Silverpine in smoke and terror, it was finally, truly over. She swayed, and Drake caught her before she could fall. "I have you," he murmured against her hair, pulling her against his chest with desperate tenderness. "I have you, little wolf. It's done. You're safe now." Freya pressed her face into his shoulder and breathed in the scent of him, pine and musk and the copper tang of blood that somehow didn't frighten her at all. Her wolf was settling, satisfied that their enemy was defeated, and their mate was close, and their pup was protected. She felt tears pricking at her eyes, but they weren't tears of grief. They were tears of relief, of gratitude, of love. "Take me inside," she whispered. "Please. I need you." Drake didn't hesitate. He lifted her into his arms, cradling her against his chest like she weighed nothing at all, and carried her through the garden gate, through the castle corridors, up the winding stairs to his chambers. Servants scattered before them, guards pressed themselves against walls to let them pass, but Freya barely noticed any of it. All she could see was Drake. All she could feel was the mate bond, blazing between them like a golden sun. He laid her on the bed with impossible gentleness, then stepped back, his amber eyes searching her face with concern that made her heart ache. "You need rest," he said, though his voice was rough with something more than worry. "After what happened, you should sleep. I'll have food brought and—" "Drake!" She reached for him, catching his hand before he could move away. "I don't want to sleep. I want—" She pulled gently, and he came, settling on the bed beside her with a questioning look. "I want to be yours, completely. I want the bond completed tonight." His breath caught. "Freya, you've just been through—" "Wait." She pressed her fingers to his lips, stopping him. "Before we do this, I need to tell you something. About Garrett." Drake went still, but his eyes remained soft, patient, waiting. "He was good," Freya said quietly. kind and gentle and everything I needed when I had nothing. I loved him, Drake. I will always love him, in the part of my heart that remembers what he gave me. She swallowed hard. I need you to know that I'm not trying to replace him. And I need you to know that loving you doesn't mean I've forgotten him. Drake's hand came up to cup her face, his thumb brushing away a tear she hadn't felt fall. I would never ask you to forget him, he said, his voice rough with emotion. The love you carry for Garrett is part of who you are. It doesn't diminish what we have. It proves that your heart is vast enough to hold more than one truth at once. He pressed his forehead to hers. I don't want to replace your first mate, Freya. I want to be your last one. There is room in your heart for both of us, and I am honored to share that space with the memory of a man who loved you well. Fresh tears spilled down her cheeks, but they were tears of release, of gratitude, of finally being understood. Now, Drake said gently, what were you saying about wanting to be mine? She laughed through her tears. I was saying I've been through the last thing that was keeping us apart. She interrupted, sitting up to face him properly. Marcus is dead. My past is done. And I am so tired of waiting, Drake. I have spent weeks lying in this bed, feeling the mate bond humming between us, wanting you so badly I could barely breathe. I don't want to wait anymore. She reached up, pushing his hair back from his face, and saw the moment when his control began to crumble. His amber eyes darkened with desire, and a low growl rumbled in his chest, not threatening, but hungry. If we do this, he said, his voice strained, there is no going back. The bond will be permanent. You will be mine forever, and I will be yours, and nothing short of death will ever separate us. I know. She leaned forward, pressing her forehead to his. I want that. I want you. I want forever. Drake made a sound that was half groan, half prayer, and then his mouth was on hers. The kiss was everything she had imagined and more, hungry and demanding and impossibly tender all at once. His hands cradled her face like she was precious, but his lips claimed hers with 9 centuries of lonely longing behind them. She melted into him, her own hands fisting in his shirt, pulling him closer until there was no space left between them. They undressed each other slowly, reverently, mapping skin with fingers and lips and whispered words of wonder. Drake's body was a landscape of old scars and hard muscle, and Freya kissed every mark she could find. Silent tributes to the battles he had survived, the centuries he had endured, the journey that had brought him to her. When they finally came together, the mate bond flared so brightly that she could almost see it. Golden light pulsing between them, binding them closer with every heartbeat. Drake moved above her with devastating patience, his amber eyes locked on hers, and Freya felt herself dissolving into sensation and emotion so overwhelming she could barely contain it. Now, she gasped, when the pleasure had built to something unbearable. Drake, please. Mark me now. He needed no further encouragement. His mouth found the junction of her neck and shoulder, that perfect spot where the claiming bite belonged, and he paused there just long enough for her to feel his breath hot against her skin. Then his teeth sank into her flesh. Pain bloomed first, sharp and bright, making her cry out. But the pain transformed almost instantly, pleasure flooding through her in waves so intense she thought she might shatter. The mate bond roared open between them, wider than she had ever felt it, and suddenly she was drowning in Drake. His emotions, his memories, his centuries of loneliness and hope and desperate longing. She felt everything he had ever felt, understood everything he had ever been, and knew that he was experiencing the same overwhelming connection with her. Mine, the bond sang. Yours. Forever. But Freya knew that the claiming wasn't complete. Wouldn't be complete. Until she returned the bite. She pushed against Drake's shoulders, and he released her immediately, pulling back with concern in his golden eyes. Did I hurt you? He asked, his voice wrecked. Freya. She silenced him by surging upward, reversing their positions until he was beneath her and she was poised above him. His eyes widened with surprise and something deeper, understanding dawning as she lowered her mouth to his shoulder. "My turn," she whispered against his skin, and she bit down. Drake's whole body arched beneath her, a sound tearing from his throat that was somewhere between a howl and her name. She felt the bond complete itself, felt it settle into her bones, her blood, her very soul. She tasted him on her tongue, salt and musk and power, and she knew with absolute certainty that she would never be alone again. When she finally released him, they lay tangled together in the aftermath, breathing hard, their bodies still trembling with the aftershocks of completion. Drake's arms wrapped around her like he would never let go, and Freya pressed her hand over his heart, feeling it beat in perfect rhythm with her own. "Mine," she breathed. "Yours," he answered, his voice breaking on the word. "Mate." The word hung between them, sacred and eternal, and Drake pressed his lips to her hair. "Forever," he promised. They held each other through the night, the mate bond settling into golden warmth between them, no longer a pulsing, desperate thing, but something steady and sure. Two broken souls, finally whole. The coronation took place 3 weeks later on a morning when the first true spring sun broke through the mountain clouds. Freya stood in the great hall of Drake's castle, wearing a gown of deep blue velvet that flowed around her growing belly like water. Her hair was crowned with a circlet of silver and sapphire, and around her throat she wore the Luna's pendant, an ancient symbol of the Alpha King's mate, passed down through generations. Drake stood beside her, his hand warm in hers, his presence a constant reassurance through their bond. Before them, the assembled wolves of 3 territories knelt in submission, Drake's own territory, the wolves who had accepted her without question, the neutral packs who had come to witness history being made, and the Silverpine wolves, their heads bowed lowest of all, their pack now absorbed into Drake's kingdom as penance for Marcus's crimes. "Rise," Drake commanded, his voice echoing through the hall, "and bear witness." The wolves rose, and Drake turned to face Freya fully. His amber eyes softened with such tenderness that she felt tears prick at her own. "Freya Shadowfang," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "You came to my border broken and alone, carrying a child and carrying grief, carrying the weight of betrayal that would have crushed a lesser wolf. But you did not break." He raised their joined hands. "You stood against your own brother. You used your gifts in defense of your mate. You showed courage that warriors twice your age might envy. And now, before these witnesses, I name you Luna, Queen of the Duskwalker territories. My mate, my equal, my forever." The roar of approval that rose from the gathered wolves was deafening. Freya felt it wash over her like a wave, all that acceptance and celebration, and she let herself smile. Really smile, for the first time in longer than she could remember. She was no longer the disgraced healer who had fled her home in smoke and terror. She was Luna Queen, mated to the Alpha King, carrying a child who would be raised in love and safety and belonging. Later, when the celebration had wound down and the guests had dispersed to their own territories, Drake led her through the castle to a garden she had never seen before. It was small and private, hidden behind walls of climbing roses, and in its center stood a bench of white stone overlooking the valley below. "I used to come here alone," Drake said softly, settling beside her on the bench. "In my darkest moments, when the centuries felt too heavy and the loneliness too vast, I would sit here and watch the sun set, and I would wonder if there was any point in continuing." Freya leaned her head against his shoulder, feeling their daughter kick gently within her. "And now? Now I bring you here." He pressed his forehead to hers, that gesture of intimate connection that had become their private language. "Now I sit beside my mate, my Luna, the mother of my child, and I cannot remember what loneliness felt like." His hand spread warm and possessive over her belly. You gave me a home too, little wolf. You gave me a reason to exist beyond duty. You gave me everything. Freya turned her face up to his, finding his lips with her own in a kiss that spoke of promises kept and promises yet to come. I love you, she murmured against his mouth. And I love you, he answered, forever. Below them, the sun was setting over the Duskwalker territories, their territories now, hers as much as his. In the distance, she could see the lights of the village beginning to flicker to life, families gathering for their evening meals, children playing in the last of the daylight. Peace, she thought. This is what peace feels like. The bond between them had settled into something steady and sure, no longer humming or pulsing but simply present, as natural as her own heartbeat. Drake's arm tightened around her, pulling her closer, and Freya let her eyes drift closed. She had lost so much. Her home, her mate, her brother, the life she had thought she would live. But in losing everything, she had found something she hadn't even known to look for. She had found her king, her mate, her forever. And in the end, that was more than enough.